Hi, I'm David Crawford. I work for the nonprofit investigative newsroom Correctiv in Germany. I have just a few slides to show you guys. I think there should be plenty of time for questions at the end. If you have an important question, feel free to jump in and ask. First of all, what is Correctiv? It's a nonprofit investigative newsroom. We're dedicated to value-added journalism. By value-added, I mean this is journalism that adds something meaningful to the public discourse. We, of course, as journalists, all like scoops, but for us, they have to be important. For example, it might be a scoop to say that, to accurately say that Prince Charles has tattoos all over his body that have been carefully hidden for decades. Might not be completely in the public interest to tell that. It might not be completely important to tell that so that we would spend months investigating it. There might be other topics that would be more important for us. I'm going to discuss a little bit about what makes Correctiv tick. That's how we fund ourselves and things like that, because I think a lot of people are interested in themselves getting involved with nonprofit journalism. Why can we do it and other people have difficulty? First of all, our name is Correctiv, research in the public interest. To translate it, we have and they help control us. We also have a board of ethics. We have a supervisory board. We have our staff, and we have the corrective community, which we set up, which is basically anybody who pays us a nominal sum of money to be a member of the community. I think we suggest 10 euros a month. There's not a lot of them right now, but we want to get feedback from them, but we also want to get feedback from our ethics board. We want feedback from our supervisory board, and also within the staff. We are constantly in discussion about, what we should be doing. Is it ethical what we're doing? Who funds us? Unlike a lot of other nonprofit newsrooms, these numbers are a little bit out of date because we don't have our second quarter numbers out. I suppose they'll be out in the next week or so. So there's probably about €500,000 missing from this right now. It could be a little bit less or a little bit more, I'm not sure. But we have initial funding from the Brost Foundation, which was founded by the founding family of one of the largest media empires in Germany. They died. All of this is on our website, so if there's no secrets here. You can just go to our website and download it. And when Erich Brost and his wife died, he died in the late 90s, and she died just a couple of years ago. Their interest in the Westdeutsche Allgemeine Zeitung were sold, and they put 300 million euros into a foundation that is supposed to do things in the public interest. And one of the ideas that they had was to fund investigative journalism. And so we then made a proposal about how we could do this. We had, before we could get started, we had to prove that we actually were worth being in the public interest. Then in Germany, that means you need to have a certificate from the tax office. In the UK, it would be Her Majesty's Revenue Office, saying you are actually working in the public interest. And when we first approached them, they said, yeah, sorry about that, but journalism is a business. It's not in the public interest. And so we had to convince them. It took us more than a year to make them understand that journalism can be in the public interest. Once we got that through, an awful lot of other people started coming to us and saying, we want to fund you too, because foundations in Germany, they can only give money to projects that are in the public interest. And once we had that seal of approval from the Revenue Office, then we're eligible to get their money. And it's amazing how many people are knocking on our door wanting to give us money. What we do education. One of the things that we had to, that we realized that we had to do, it was easier for the Revenue Office to understand education as being in the public interest. And so we train journalists. We also train normal readers to understand journalism better. We do value-added investigations. We put out books. We do seminars. We train, for example, we go from town to town and we have a road show teaching everyday people and also journalists how to use the Freedom of Information Act. So we do an awful lot of that. And also all of our stories we have a steal our story policy, so anybody can just take our stories and publish it within certain guidelines. We don't want them just to edit the story the way they want and put it out in our name, because that would leave us open to lawsuits. That our stories are often carefully lawyered to be sure that we're not going to be sued. And so we put out different versions of the story in different lengths, so you can take the 50-line version, the 100-line version, or you could take the long version, which may take readers a half an hour or longer to read. Okay, we want to do important stories, and we want to do neglected topics, topics that should be covered by the mainstream media, but they don't do them, often because they're too expensive, because they're not sexy enough, or what things. That we have a standard that we have for judging whether stories are important. A little bit later today, I'll be talking about our MH17 story. At the beginning, when I started that project, I was asking myself, is this story in the public interest for us to do? Other people do stories about plane crashes and stuff like that. So I needed to, first of all, do a little brainstorming with some of my colleagues and try to decide, is this story really in the public interest? But for me, my personal guidelines is this: wow, I didn't know that Prince Charles and what he may or may not have tattooed on his body might fit that category, but maybe it's not in the public interest. Second thing is we want to generate a discussion. So it has to be something I didn't know that. Two, it has to be in the public interest. And we hope ultimately to create an impact for positive change. And so we try to look for stories where this is being neglected, but if people really understood this topic, then perhaps something important can change. And the way to get there is by generating discussion. One of the reasons why we founded Correctiv was because of weaknesses in Germany. You have weak financial structures in the media, that the newspapers, editorial offices are generally underfunded, too few people trying to do too much things. There's a lot of political pressure. There's a lot of police investigations also against journalists. I've had so many. Before somebody sues you in Germany, generally they file criminal charges against you, and I've had that happen to me a bunch of times. It's the issue of privacy rights of the people that you're writing about. You have to take that into consideration. And then there's these lawsuits, and I've had an awful lot of lawsuits. I end up winning them, but I always worked for people who were willing to go to court to defend the media. Most media organizations in Germany won't do that. They'll just retract the story. Or not do the story in the first place. What are the German media strengths? There is a lot of competition. There is a strong political system that you can use. Sometimes there's a strong court system that you can use to ultimately get your rights. And there's 16 states in the federal government, which means that if the justice minister in Berlin won't tell you something, then you go to the justice minister in the state of Saxony or in Lower Saxony or in North Rhine-Westphalia or in Bavaria. That you've got a lot of venues to do that. And a lot of what I do is not just going to those states. I go to, a lot of times, the finance minister in Germany won't tell you something, so you just go to the finance minister in Austria. He has a lot more time, and it's easy to get an appointment with people like that. And they know everything that the finance minister in Germany has. It's the same with the defense minister. Why go to the defense minister in London? You can go to the defense minister in Switzerland or in Italy, or a lot of, the smaller the country generally, the more time they have to talk to people. And so, but in Germany, with these 16 states, it means that you have 17 shots at getting the information. We'll look at some of this things. Preparation. Generally, preparation for me is getting the stuff you get for free. And by for free, I don't mean paying money, because I personally never pay money for stories. But getting it for free means getting the information without the people you're going to write about knowing that you're writing about them, so that they can't put an injunction against you. This means reading books, looking in archives, talking to your own colleagues is also often very, very helpful, because maybe one of your colleagues has already written about this person or that company and can give you some advice about what to do. You conduct interviews. A lot of the examples that, because Corrective has been around for just 1 year, a lot of the examples that I'll be giving are basically from my previous incarnations. But here you conduct interviews. You do quick hit stories. I was terrorism correspondent at the Wall Street Journal for a while. And one of the things is that with terrorism, there was very restricted access to information. And I don't want to beg for information. I want to have it. And so I realized that under German law, the family and next of kin of victims in a murder case have the right to all the evidence in the case. And so I said, well, let's look for a co-plaintiff. Let's look for somebody who has the right to this information, get them a lawyer, and we can get the information. My bosses in New York said, no, we're not allowed to play God. If somebody wants to intervene in a case, that's fine. We'll ask them for the information. That wasn't good enough for me. I did 3 stories about the rights of co-plaintiffs, and everybody I interviewed for the story signed up as a co-plaintiff. And so then you get those stories. Then you get the information that the co-plaintiffs were collecting. This was the first 100 loose-leaf binders of information, I think 40,000 pages or something like that. In the end, we collected 400 of these binders in Germany. We did the same thing in the Netherlands. We did it in Spain. We did it in an awful lot of countries and collected everything that we could get using the same strategy of co-plaintiffs. You collect the information and you analyze it, and then you do stories. A lot of times the stories that you do, you don't really know in the beginning. You've just collected so much information that, for example, when Colin Powell, who was the American Secretary of State, went before the UN Security Council in 2003 to justify the invasion of Iraq, I was watching this in our conference room in Berlin, and I said, hey, wait a second, it's not true what he's saying, that in all those boxes, we have several binders of German intelligence reports looking exactly at this issue, which happened to be mixed in with all the al-Qaeda information. And so we pulled out those binders and did a story the next day saying, hey, wait a second, what Colin Powell is saying, facts don't fit, that German intelligence has a completely different view of it. And we were able to cite wiretaps, an awful lot of information to justify it. Colin Powell, a couple days later, handed in his resignation, but it wasn't accepted until after the next election. But So this story had an impact, even though we didn't really know about it at the time. You have to then go beyond the quick hit stories and the things that, when we were looking at this, we also found a business card of a Saudi diplomat. And we wondered why his business card was found in the apartment of one of the suspects in the September 11th investigation. And so I started to investigate him. And I thought, first, this is going to be an easy investigation because he wasn't just head of the Islamic Affairs Department at the embassy. He was also the cultural attaché. And cultural attachés are easy to investigate because they are active in the multicultural circles in Germany. And I thought, there must be dozens of people who know him. So I went and started talking to all these people, but I had a hard time finding anybody who knew him. And so I kept asking myself, who is this guy? There's a story about how to get this photograph of somebody who refuses to be photographed as a story in itself. But we did manage to get his photo. But it was this question, who is he? And since nobody I talked to seemed to know in multicultural circles knew him, I then started asking myself, okay, what could he have done? And I got the idea that there was a visit in 2002 of the head of the Muslim World League to Germany. And so I went and got all of the information I could about this visit, including the participants' lists of the different events that he was at, and just started phoning these people. None of the Germans knew anything about Mr. Feki, but when I started talking to the Arabs who participated, they all said, oh yeah, we know him quite well. And I said, yeah, but did he organize this event? I mean, this is an important Saudi official. And he said, well, no, he doesn't speak English, he doesn't speak German, and he's afraid of music. Now, if you're a cultural attaché and are afraid of music, you don't go to concerts. There's a lot of events that you don't go to. One of his best friends said to me, you know, when he got into my car once, and the first thing he did was turned off the radio. And he said to him, hey, wait a second, we need to have that on. Otherwise, you know, we won't get the traffic reports. And he said, yeah, but what are we going to do if they suddenly play music? Very difficult situation. Anyway, I knew he was a little bit out of place, but I didn't, you know, I still didn't have any documents from him, and the kind of journalism I do, you want documents. And so I started thinking, how am I going to get documents? And I thought, well, let's look for his letters. So I started traveling around. I went to London and Paris and the Netherlands, a whole bunch of countries, looking for people who might have been in correspondence with him at different embassies and stuff there. And in the Netherlands, I got a big stack of correspondence from the embassy, which I couldn't read. So I came here to London and took it all with me and visited somebody who works for a Saudi human rights organization. And he looked at it and he started laughing. And I said, why are you laughing? He said, this is correspondence, business letters on embassy stationery, but it's written as poetry. And I said, well, is this good poetry? And he said, no, it's terrible. So I flew back to the Netherlands and found the diplomat who wrote this stuff. And I said, why are you writing poems to your interior minister, which is what this is? He said, well, in Saudi Arabia, if you want to achieve something, you always need a signature from somebody from the royal family. But they're always busy. They're on their yacht in the Red Sea, or they're at their farm someplace riding camels or something. You can't get them. And so you always have to do something. And he said, I'm just a poor public servant. So I can't put money in the letter along with my things. And so I write poems. Okay, I was able to do a story about diplomatic poetry, which I held until after my main story about Feki thing, because I thought it would just frighten people away from talking to me. But I still didn't have any documentation from Feki, but I did have a question, and that was, what was Mr. Feki's trick for getting his letters read? And so I went back and went around and talked to all the people I'd been talking before, and I said, what was Mr. Feki's trick? And he said, well, his trick was that there's an old-fashioned form of Arabic that's basically died out, but it's used in Saudi Arabia in the royal court. And so he had his letters written in this old-style Arabic. But he couldn't write it that way himself, so he had somebody who wrote it for him. And when I heard that, then I thought, aha, if that's true, and I knew he was deported basically within 24 hours, that on very, very short notice, that the German Foreign Ministry called the acting ambassador to the Foreign Ministry office and basically said he has to leave now. And this was around noon on a Saturday that this meeting took place, and he flew out at 10 the next morning. So I knew he didn't have a lot of notice, and I thought, okay, well, if that's the case, then there's probably a computer in Berlin someplace that has his correspondence on it. And so I looked for that computer, and when I found it, I had everything he wrote. And so then I was able to build the story around his own correspondence. And this letter was a little bit problematic because there's one line in there where it says, if there's going to be a time where there's a conflict between Muslims and others, and we have to be prepared for it. And this is the funding for a moschee, and they said that we need to own this moschee in order to have a base for this conflict should it come. And I had this letter translated by 3 different people because I didn't want to interpret the word conflict myself. I didn't know whether it was violent conflict. I didn't know whether it was legal conflict. In the end, I put it in the most moderate terms of it could just be a disagreement. I decided I would let the readers decide for themselves. If I put a very hard interpretation on it, it's just giving somebody penalty shots at me. So I don't want to put my own prejudices in front, and people can decide for themselves. So then we were able to finally do the story. We eventually were even able to get the photograph, which you have to get a story on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. And we got then the story in. It's funny that Mr. Feki's friends all liked the story because they thought that their view of him was properly presented. And the people who hate anything that has to do with Arabs, they loved the story too, which was kind of difficult. It's one of the problems of being terrorism correspondent at a place like the Wall Street Journal is that there's a lot of strange people who like your stuff. Yes?
I was a bit intrigued by your comment that you were aware that there was a computer where you'd written everything.
Well, I suspected
on it.
Can
I finish? That you'd come across it, and I just wondered how you located that computer and came across it.
An awful lot of people wrote about this computer. Nobody mentioned that I was involved and that I was the one who got it, because it's just it's become sort of mystical. So if you Google Saudi embassy computer in Berlin, Feki, you can find a lot of information about this computer, none of which I have actually put out, but it became sort of a legend. And, but it was one of my projects.
So you saying that you found the information through what was on Google about the computer? Or the
No, I'm saying that after I did this project, later that computer became famous because it was used in a lawsuit of victims. The September 11 victims, they did a class action lawsuit, or their relatives did a class action lawsuit against the Saudi royal family, and this computer ended up playing an important role as an important piece of evidence in that case. See, my problem with this computer is it's this huge computer that's filled with information that I can't read. So I needed, to find different people who would help me read it, and I sure wasn't going to give it to the government. And so, I mean, the Wall Street Journal made that mistake once when a colleague of mine ended up buying his laptop broke, so he bought a laptop at a bazaar in Afghanistan just after the U.S. Invasion, and it turned out it was one of Osama bin Laden's deputy. He did a bunch of really, really good stories based on the information in that thing, but the powers that be at the Wall Street Journal said, hey, wait a minute, if there's information on this computer that would save somebody's life, because if they're planning a murder someplace, then don't we have an obligation to make sure that that doesn't happen? And so they ended up turning over the, I guess they turned over a copy of the hard drive to the police in the US. They did not give it to the CIA, who I suppose probably wanted it. They had said they would share with us any information they found on it. Of course, they didn't share anything. And you know, this computer was kind of a poison pill for the journal anyway. That part of the information they found on it was related to the so-called shoe bomber who tried to ignite his shoe on fire. And so they had, you know, basically his personnel, his Al-Qaeda personnel file was on there. And one of my colleagues in the South Asia correspondent, Daniel Pearl, went trying to investigate some of his contacts there, and those inquiries led to his own beheading. And so this computer was a very, yeah, I don't know, I call it a poison pill. It was not really that good for us, and for the colleague of mine who found it, I guess, you know, he did a lot of really, really good stories with it. But anyway, I think it would have been better for him never to say that we had the computer. And I never wrote in a Wall Street Journal story that I ever have documents. I almost always have the documents. But all of these boxes that I showed there before, basically until I stopped working with these documents, we never mentioned that they existed because we were afraid that the authorities were going to seize them from us. And, but we collected tons and tons of stuff because I'm certainly not going to go to the FBI and beg for information. I want to have my own sources. And we knew a way to do it that wasn't possible in the US. Nobody liked to talk and nobody's going to ask a question? Yeah?
Well, I'd like to hear about Corrective. What's going on now? What story do you present?
Oh, we have so many stories. It's unbelievable. We've put out, in the last year, we put out 3 books. One book on how to write, basically part of our education series. We did a book about MH17. We did a graphic novel about neo-Nazi extremism in Germany and how that goes up. We did it as a graphic novel because one of the things was we have all of this information that might help people decide not to get involved with neo-Nazi groups. But if we wrote an article, straight news story about it, I mean, which one of these people are going to read it? And we thought the way to get it in front of those people is maybe to do a graphic novel, so we did that. That they're more likely to look at cartoons than they are to read a long news story. But basically, our strategy is to think about what you're writing, what you're trying to present, and look for the best forum for presenting it. And in that one case, we thought graphic novel. MH17, we did a huge multimedia thing to present it because we could do it that way. Sometimes we'll just do events and just pull people together, and instead of just putting it out, we might later then do an ebook about the events or film 1 or 2 of the events for people who couldn't come to it and post them online. But we basically, everything we do, we think about how can we get this out in front of people and what's the best way to present it. And we have a lot of people who are really, really interested in finding new ways to present information. Yeah, we're doing an awful lot of stuff. I'm in charge of what we call secret investigations, and so my stuff we don't talk about. We have also completely open investigations that one of the first things we announced is that there's a publicly owned bank in Germany called the German Sparkasse Savings Bank system. And we said that we are going to be investigating this. It's going to be completely in the open. There are not going to be any secret investigations. We want people to come forward and tell their stories and stuff like that. And that's getting close to being published. They've been collecting the information on that for a year. So we have all different kinds of investigations, from investigations that are completely open to investigations which we hope to keep under wraps until we throw them out there, like MH17.
Do you have a prospect of publishing with mainstream media or other alternative media?
Everything we do goes to mainstream. Yeah, everything is probably always wrong term to use, shouldn't be used in journalism probably, but most of what we do goes out. What we generally do is we look for a partner, and MH17 we did with the largest German news magazine, Der Spiegel. So they got the story for free, and they went online, or on their publication date was identical with the date we went online. We had different versions of the story because we put out a lot more information than they did. But because we also put out the transcripts of most of our interviews and a whole bunch of stuff that they're not interested in doing, because we wanted to make it as transparent as possible. But virtually, or we try anyway, we look for partners. Sometimes with MH17, we wanted a partner that also has an international voice, which Der Spiegel does. And so we went with them with that. We do a lot of stuff with local newspapers because they don't have a budget for investigations. We had one idea that in Germany, a lot of criminal investigations are ended if you're willing to donate money to a nonprofit organization. And the judge or the prosecutor will dictate the organization and say, give it to this organization. And so we decided, well, nobody really knows, and this involves millions of euros, and it goes into the pet projects of some judge or prosecutor. So we went around and we got one guy who spent months contacting every prosecutor's office in Germany and every court in Germany and saying, we want a list of everything, all the money that has gone there. We want to know what nonprofit organization got how much money on such and such a date. We want it for the last 3 years. At first, nobody wanted to cooperate and said privacy, and we pounded at them and threatened to sue them. In the end, all except for one state ended up giving us the information. A lot of it was faxed documents and stuff like that they gave, so we had people who basically digitalized all of this and created a database of this, and then we made images of the original documents. And so you can go to our website, you can put in, for example, volunteer fire department. If you key that in, you'll get a list of all of the volunteer fire departments in Germany that got money in this way. And they got next to nothing. They got, over 3 years, a few 10,000 euros, but nothing. There were an awful lot of carnival associations that got 6 digits or more. There's a couple organizations that I thought kind of questionable, and they got millions. So we basically put that information out there, and we started a campaign to get local newspapers just to key in the name of their town, because it's so simple to do the story. You key in the name of your town and you get a list of everybody from that town or every organization in that town that got money, and you can look at it. There was one group of judges in Munich, for example, who founded a nonprofit organization to fund historic excavations in Egypt. And that organization got tons and tons of money every year. We tried to look into it. We found that there was an awful lot of travel by these judges to those excavation sites. We've published that with a local newspaper in Munich. We did not go to the big local newspaper there, the Süddeutsche Zeitung, because they're quite known for their investigations, and we thought we would do one of their competitors something good, and so they ended up getting this big story, and we're trying to think of ways, and then we went back and got all the information. I think now we have everything posted from 2003 up until 2014, because we updated it this year again with the new information for 2014, and we thought while we're at it, we'll get everything going all the way back as far as we could. And so that's something that basically it's a tool that any freelance journalist or any local journalist who doesn't really have access to resources, they can just use that to do stories. We also put up a crowdfunding site in which we ask freelance journalists to present a proposal to us, and then we post their proposal for a story, and they're supposed to say what they want to investigate and how much they think it would cost. And then if we think that they're actually capable of conducting this investigation seriously, then we will support them, and we think that this investigation is in the public interest, so it has to meet our standards. Then we put this up there, and I guess, I'm not sure how many. I know that the first group that went out were 6 of these projects, and we keep every month or so, we put out another 1 or 2 of them and stuff like that. We guarantee the donors that that project is going to be done, even if the person who put in the proposal to begin with is injured or whatever, can't do it or loses interest. So that money won't be lost. But we think that's a public service just for other freelancers and stuff like that, that if you've got a good idea. Some of the proposals that we've got, we looked at and we just thought, we don't think that this person has never done this type of investigation before. They haven't studied journalism. They haven't worked as a freelancer yet seriously. We think that they should probably get some experience working for a local paper someplace and then come and present a proposal. But we try to do as many different things. I mean, we have money. We have resources. We have a website that a lot of people come to visit. And so we try to put this, use this to fund different kinds of journalism. Some of it we do ourselves, or majority of it we do ourselves because we have our funding. And, but we also try to help freelancers. And there's a bunch, I guess we have 14 paid staff. And I think we have part-time people and freelancers. I think that gets boosted up to another 10. I don't think we have 30, but people in all, including freelancers. But we're growing, but we can only grow as fast as we have donors that can provide the money, and they have to give us the money without any strings attached. That we won't let them dictate to us what we're going to do. But we do have, I mean, it's, as far as nonprofit journalism is concerned, it's a pretty luxurious situation that we have. But we also spent more than a year setting this whole thing up before to make it, we had to make it possible for the people to support us. I had stories where I had people who, you know, generally I go and find the people who have the information. But I think using whistleblowers is also a very passive way to do journalism. We should be active. We should be going out there looking for people before they become whistleblowers. But that's a different issue. But you know, if there is one there, then first of all, your duty should be not to say be a whistleblower. The best thing you should do is say go back and do your job. You'll be a lot more helpful to me if you keep your job and stay there doing this, and it's a lot less likely that people will know that you're doing. And then don't say that you have a whistleblower. You know, that there's a lot of good reasons not for naming sources, not even many of my very, very best sources are never mentioned in any story. There's no reason to name people if you have other sources that you can cite. And if you know everything about a topic, you can always find a way to tell that story safely. It's a lot easier just by asking the whistleblower who also knows about this. And then going and talking to that person and talking to everybody else who deals with that person, so that if there's an investigation, everybody will know that you talked to 24 different people, and they have a long list of everybody you've talked to except for the person who was actually helpful. So, I mean, there's an awful lot of ways to protect people. And it certainly would have been advisable to tell Snowden, don't become a whistleblower. There's no need for you to be a whistleblower. And that would have been the way to protect him. I mean, it's certainly, you know, I think it's completely irresponsible to deal with people that way. You have to find a way to protect people. If I'm going to an important interview, I don't take my cell phone with me because I know my cell phone can be tapped. And I know that the people who I'm writing about, major corporations, for example, they're going to be tracking my cell phone. It costs nothing. I did a own investigation. I asked my wife, who at the time was working in a different country, and then another person who I knew. I said, we're going to track 3 phones. My phone, this other person's phone, and my wife's phone for the next month. So we all 3 knew that we were going to be tracked. And so one person was down in Bavaria, I was in Berlin, and my wife was working in Belgrade. And so, you know, this person who was tracking us, when I went down to talk to this other person in Bavaria, he sent me an SMS, welcome to Bavaria, when I crossed the border on the train. Then we were sitting at a restaurant, in a vineyard restaurant, you know, looking at the view, having lunch. And he sent us both an SMS saying, I hope you're enjoying your meal. When my wife drove with a car across the mountains to Montenegro, she got a message saying, welcome to Montenegro, you know, when she crossed the border. That, I mean, he basically there's telephones have to be able to know where somebody is. Cell phones have to know where somebody is in order to relay the phone call to you. For example, yesterday evening I flew from Berlin to London. My cell phone needed to know I'm in a different location. I turned it off when I got onto the plane, I didn't turn it off, but I turned off the radio thing. iPhones can't be turned off. But I turned it off so it wasn't communicating with the thing when I got on the plane, and then I turned it on here. It knew I was here, that a couple seconds after I arrived, it started and turned it back on. It started beaming me with, you know, short text messages and emails, and I didn't get a phone call, but, you know, I might have. And so it knew where I was. In cities, a lot of times it doesn't know exactly where you are unless you have the GPS function also turned on, in which case it probably knows very, very accurately where you are. And, you know, you can ask your cell phone, for example, to you know, keep track of where you are so that, you know, can suggest restaurants and stuff like that. Every country in the world has a phone company that has a database of all the cell phones in the world. They have to have it. The phone company has to have it because they have to know this guy's in Afghanistan or this guy is in Argentina. And so they know the UK has one, the NSA has one, along with the phone companies there. But, you know, in Finland they have it. In Finland, the phone company anybody can pay them a little bit of money, and they charge you, I think, 2 or 3 cents to check any phone. And so what this colleague did, who did this for me for the test, just because I wanted to know how endangered I am, he set it up every 5 minutes. It would ask where I was and get my location. He did it for me, he did it for my wife, and he did it for this other person. And so he was tracking us every 5 minutes. I think it was costing him 2 or 3 cents. He did it for a month. And at the end of the month, we had a list of everywhere we had gone. And now I know, don't take your phone with you, because they won't just be tracking me. They'll also be tracking the person who I'm talking to. And then, you know, they can see us converging on each other. They can see us walking together. They can see us going into the restaurant. Don't take your cell phone with you. You're always being watched. And also, my wife now works in Moscow. We never, if we want to talk privately, we don't have our phones with us, because your cell phone is really a microphone. And with the, you know, that people can listen to everything. So, you know, anytime we take a walk, she'll say, well, do you have your phone with you? And I say, and either I say, oh, I forgot, and we'll go and put it away, or things. And so, you know, basically you just have to assume that cell phone in your pocket is a dangerous thing to have around if you're trying to protect somebody.
Sorry, just to pick up on what you're saying, it's not just the phones, but like if you're having boxes like that delivered, somebody's going to notice. What's to stop somebody kind of coming in and hacking or breaking into your offices and knowing exactly what you're working on and what you've got?
Yeah, okay. I mean, this was a problem that basically I said to my boss, you know, look, there's a window of opportunity here to get it that, you know, what I want to do, nobody's going to allow me to do. That you know, when you ask somebody for permission to get something like that, you have to be careful who you're asking, and you never want to give somebody the power to say no to you. And I knew that the person who was heading the office where that was would say no. And so I wasn't going to give him the power to do that. I went to the person who was paying him, and I said to that person, I need to have an office there in where this stuff is, and I need to be able to work there quietly for a few weeks and do what I want. And so he told that person, give him an office with a locked door and let him do what he wants. And so I arranged to have 2 heavy-duty copying machines delivered by truck and by forklift into that room, 2 or 3 pallets of paper and a pallet of ink cartridges, and had 2 news assistants in there for 5 days until we copied everything. And I knew at the end of that office guy who felt duped because I didn't ask him, I knew he'd say no, so why should I give him the power to do that? When we sent everything, every evening, people came and removed several of those boxes. As soon as, at the end of every evening, you know, 3 or 4 boxes were going out and were delivered to our office in Berlin, where we set up cabinets to hold all of this stuff. And then we just didn't talk about it for years. But I got it all copied. I knew they would never let me do that for more than 3 weeks or something like that. And I just said, look, we've got a window of opportunity. We've got to get this stuff now. And so I thought that was the way to do it. The guy was terrified. He wanted the door locked the whole time this was going on because he knew those 2 news assistants were in there making noise, copying all this stuff. And he wanted us out of there as soon as possible. He wasn't willing to lose a lucrative client, so we were able to get what we wanted. But the nice thing about it is I knew he'd never do that again. He never would allow any of the competitors to get it, because I didn't want it just for myself. I wanted to prevent the New York Times from getting it, and I sure didn't want Der Spiegel to have it. And so I wanted to have it, and I wanted it for us. and we managed to do that. And that's the kind of stuff we do at Corrective too. You need to have the time to work with this stuff. And after this story about Colin Powell came out, the New York Times needed a week and basically ran the exact same story that we did, basically citing the same quotes that we had, and even interviewing the same expert that we had interviewed a week before. And the New York Times guy who wrote it, I had lunch with him a few weeks later, and he said, well, do you actually have a copy of those documents? And I said, I have it. And he said, what do you have? I said, I have everything. He said, everything? I said, everything. Everything that Germany knows, we know. And he never wrote another story about September 11th terrorism after that. He just quit and went to a different topic. We had a list of every story the New York Times could write on that topic with the dates we thought they could write, because we knew the court schedule, and we knew that they'd have to have somebody sitting in the courtroom to take notes. And we did every story 3 days before the court hearings, just to, I don't know, it was just sport, but yeah.
Do you have a set of lawyers you normally work with, media lawyers, or how do you structure your legal defense?
We have a couple pro bono lawyers who do this for us. Sometimes the legal department at the partner will do it. We did the multi-resistant Keim, our germ story, for example. We did that in conjunction with Die Zeit, which is one of the big weekly magazines in Germany. And their legal people looked at it and made sure that it was bulletproof. At Spiegel, obviously their legal people are going to look at it too, and we have our people looking at it as well. We also amazingly have managed to get insurance, legal insurance, but that doesn't really help you before the stories go out, and that's the best time. Everything that I did at the Wall Street Journal was lawyered. And I wanted it to be lawyered. It's one of the reasons why even today I write hardly anything on Twitter, because I know what happens, if you, put a comma in the wrong place. And at the Journal, a lot of times, I can remember one time, I wrote something and the lawyer came back and he said, like your story, but there's one thing that you could change. And I said, what's that? And he said, here, go to this, in this paragraph, do a paragraph mark and start a new paragraph. And I said, why do you have to do that? And he says, well, you've got these two ideas in the paragraph. One is a pretty hard allegation, and the other is a name of somebody. If you have both of those in the same paragraph, it's giving him a penalty shot to go after you. Put it in two different paragraphs. He said, why not even just move it down 3 paragraphs? Have the same information, it's in the story, but he can't say that we're associating him with this allegation. And the readers can think about whether he should be associated with it, but we don't need to give that guy a penalty shot to go after us. And so, you become kind of dependent on these people who are really giving you good advice. And, sometimes, it's kind of frustrating. I did a series about Putin and how this big German bank was giving him money. And they said, great story, no secret sources. And I said, what? And he said, no. He said, if we write that according to a policeman who doesn't want to be named, this company paid money to him, that bank is going to sue us. And either we put up the name of that source or we're going to lose the lawsuit. We don't want to lose the lawsuit. Look for another source. So we had to find another source for that. It took me 3 months to track down people who you'd start the interview with them and they'd say, if somebody knows that I'm talking to you, I'm probably going to be shot. And then getting them to have the civil courage to go on the line and to make these allegations in public. we were able to help them. I did an interview with the former CEO of that bank. And he was fire and flame. He wanted this interview because the topic of the interview was his successful expansion of the bank into Eastern Europe. And he thought he was going to be celebrated as a hero on the front page. And for 70 minutes, we did his interview. And I filled up my notebook with everything I needed to know about him and the relations to the bank, to important people, and all of these things. And then I slipped in a question about payments to Putin. He answered one. A couple minutes later, talked about a couple other things. I slipped in a question about the second thing. He confirmed that. And then he ended up confirming a third question. After the third question, he said, hey, you're not actually going to write about this stuff. And I said, that's why we're here. He threw me out of the office. But I had 3 payments that were confirmed. The same questions we sent to Putin. I think the interview started at 1 p.m. Frankfurt time in Germany, and at precisely the same time, the same questions were faxed to Putin's office. Putin's office the next morning called the bureau chief, our bureau chief in Moscow, and said, yeah, Mr. Crawford, he doesn't seem to understand the situation, and none of this is true. 2 days later, we sent the same questions again, but said, Dresdner Bank CEO Bernhard Walter confirmed, and then boom, the same question. And then they had the problem of either denying it despite the fact that the bank had confirmed it, or finding their own spin for it. And so they ended up finding their own spin for it, which meant that I got my people off the hook because I had the company and I had the president's office confirming these 3 payments. I had a long list of other payments which I would have liked to use, but to a certain extent those payments are a telephone book of numbers. So we only went with these 3 payments that we had confirmed, and we never got sued. And we got the story in without any. Later, Putin was asked about it, and he said he knew who had paid for that story, but I don't know who could have paid for a story. First of all, where there are no confidential sources in it. But that's a thing that. Anyway, we can go into more details. We'll be talking a little bit in the MH17 thing in an hour after lunch, where we'll look a little bit more at the nuts and bolts. I don't know if any of you guys have met Anna Politskaya, who was murdered a few years ago. That I went to meet her once when she came to Germany. That just because I wanted to meet her and just thought she was very what a brave person. Anyway, and she was speaking at an event, and I talked to her, and she said, oh, let's go and sit down and have a cup of coffee. So I'm not really great friends with her. I had coffee with her once. But we were sitting around and talking, and I realized that she knew she was going to be killed. She knew it. You could feel it in her pores. And she said, yeah, when she's talking about herself, when she was raising her kids, she decided she had to leave Russia until her kids were all 18 or older, and then she went back. And she kept writing about Chechnya, and that's a topic that the Russian government didn't want to have discussed. And everybody knew she was going to be writing about that, and she kept writing about it. And she knew that she had a choice of 2 things. She could live to be 90 years old in a dictatorship, or she could be 50 in a free country. And she lived in that free country where there was press freedom, where she could write what she wanted, but she could only be 50 years old. She knew that was going to happen, and she was 50, and then she was killed. I don't do that. I change my topics. I mean, protecting yourself is also a skill that journalists need to have, and one of the things that I do is that I write about something, and then I move on to the next topic. Then I write about Iran, then I write about North Korea, then I write about something else, Siemens. I spent a year just doing Siemens. I mean, you can change your topic and move to something else. That's basically the best protection you have, is to be changing your stories, moving on to different areas and going back. There's no reason to constantly be hitting with one topic. You can always go by. I mean, there's other people who can also do that at that topic, give them a chance, and then come back to it a year or so later, especially, you know, when you're dealing with people like that are so dangerous. But, I mean, Anna, she wanted to do that, and she wasn't willing to compromise, and she knew she was going to die for it, and she was killed, but she lived in a free country.